So my lightning talk is going to be on a app I've been building. Let's see. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, we can see your screen now.
Okay, cool. So let me make this bigger. Okay. So I built this command line interface tool slash, I guess you could call it a framework. It started off as just a file generator. I was learning React, and if anyone's actually tried to go through and learn React or any JavaScript framework, there's a lot of boilerplate code that you just have to type over and over and over. And coming from Rails, if you've never learned a JavaScript framework, you're kind of spoiled and you don't realize how nice it is that Rails does so much for you. So I built this application called Mikey. And if you go on NPM, which is a node packet manager, if you're not familiar, it's kind of like Ruby gems. And you can download this package. And over the past, I'd say, 2 months, maybe, I've been building this out and adding features to it. So like I said, I started as a file generator, and eventually I added project generation, and I've recently added 2 other types of projects. So let's start with that. If I type in Mikey, it's just like Rails generate, basically. It's actually very inspired by it. So if I type in Mikey and then new, if I just want a regular project, which is right here, and then the project name. So if I type in just a random name, it starts running, it transfers all the files over to where you currently are in your current directory, and then it starts running npm install, which is like kind of like how you install Ruby gems. So I already pre-did this. So after it's done, this is what you'll see. And I kind of added a little cool colorful art to it for fun. I was bored. But after it's done, it tells you the name of the project and what command you need to use to start it. And the thing with Node on NPM, there's this thing called the package JSON, which has different commands in it. So that's why I specify this, because it could be different depending on which project you're in. So if I check out so once it's done installing, you can run it. It tells you the port it's on. And it's as simple as that to get a project up and running. The nice thing about this over just creating it from a random boilerplate is I've organized it logically, like you would see in Rails, where you have a views folder or you have an assets folder. It's very similar. So that leads me into talking about, let me get out of this. So in Mikey, you can also generate files. And it generates the file and it finds your folder. So this can also be used outside of Mikey, kind of, as long as the folder is named properly, it'll find it. So if it's nested deeply within your project, it will generate the file exactly where it should. Otherwise, it will generate it in the root of your project, the directory you're in. So it'll generate it no matter what. And if you have the folder type properly named, it will go exactly where you expect it to. And also, if you have a test directory, it pre-generates some tests. So if I go and I launch an IDE, So here you can see the source directory has your CSS, your images, your configuration files. Here's the package JSON with those commands I was talking about earlier. Here's a start command that I use to launch the server. All your dependencies, which are like your gems, your Ruby gems, for those who aren't familiar. Here's my tests folder, the folder where all my React files would go, and everything's set up already. So if I go into and I generate a container, for example, it's just like Rails generate. So I go Mikey, and then the command is right here, and then the file name. And I try to make this as user-friendly as possible. So then I also tell you pretty much most of the details you would want to know. It tells you if it's successful or not. It saves that random path that it finds, and I actually save it to this randomly generated folder. And these are all your paths within your project. So if say you don't have the folder names like components, say it's named something different, you can actually change it or modify these routes. And the reason also why I save it is because it's faster than randomly finding the path every single time. All it has to do is read this folder and the specific file. And then if you look down here, it says it's successfully created, and it also tells you that it created a test. And if the test or file exists already, it tells you that it exists already. So you're not overwriting the files you've already created. Another nice thing about Mikey and the file generation aspect to it is that if you look here, this is the file that I just generated, this container, and I'll show you the test. This is the test I generated. If you look up here, there's these imports, and in JavaScript, you have to implicitly import different things you're intending to use per file, which can be kind of, if you're coming from Ruby, it's kind of tedious at times. But what I've done is when you create a file, for example, you can actually import things on creation, which I guess it would be similar to when you create like a migration file and you want to implicitly say, I want this certain field with this data type. So if I generate I'll generate a component this time, which is a different file. Let's do this. So I can type in -i, and then it will add this import, this dependency to the top of the file. So if I import, this is a HTTP library, it's not very important, but if I do that, and we look, here's a test component. Oh, wait a sec. Maybe I have a bug. It didn't generate it. Let me see. I think I have a bug. Okay, anyway. It's another thing on the list to fix. So you can import, or you're supposed to be able to import dependencies to the top of the file. And then if you have several files you want to generate, say I have several components like this that I just generated, and they all have similar dependencies, I add them to what's called defaults, which is this right here. And every time you import something, it gets added to that specific file type's default. So if I wanted to, instead of typing out a bazillion different imports like this, like if I did and I wanted to import like another import and I did like a bazillion different types, I don't have to do that over and over for every single file. I can just include defaults by typing this, and it will add the defaults to that file. And I said before that it tells you if it's already generated, and this is what it looks like. And you can list your defaults also. So if I go Mikey-L, which is for the short for the list right here, and you can type in the specific file type you want to list your defaults for. So I can just do all. I don't know if it added it or not. So because it's bugged, but it lists out every single file type and the defaults you have for that file type. And then if you want to erase any defaults, you can do that with this command. And you can choose the file type or do all of them. Unfortunately, I'm thinking of adding possibly specific ones. It's kind of, I don't know how useful it would be. But if you type in Mikey-E, and then you can erase all your defaults, just like that. And then the last thing that I added recently is custom file templates. So if you're not happy with any of the predefined boilerplate templates that I have here, you can actually create a file in your project and save that file and reuse it over and over and over. So we can walk through that. If I go and type Mikey, save template, and then you type in the file type. So in my project, say I really like this nav bar. I want to save that component. So I type in component, and it's singular, and then I press enter. It lists all the components in that folder right here, and you can select which one you want. So I can just do nav bar. You don't need the extension. And then I do that, and it saves it. If I want to list it, this is listing it. This is what it would look like. But if you want to just list it without doing anything like creating or saving or deleting a template, I can just list it. Mikey lists templates, and then same thing. I can type component, and it will list every single saved component template. And then if I really don't like this template, I can delete it. But first, I'm going to actually use this template. So I'm going to have to delete this because I already have it. And then if you look right here, I have this G file, which generates a custom file from a saved template. So I can type Mikey, G file, and then the file type. So I can type component again, just like before. It gives me all the saved components that I have, and I just type navbar, and then I can change the file name. So it doesn't have to be called navbar. I can call it literally anything else. But we already deleted navbar, so it's fine. I can just say navbar, and it generates it. And it also does everything you would expect it to do with testing. et cetera, et cetera. And then the other two things I want to talk about, which I added recently, are universal applications, and I also have an Electron template. So you can develop desktop apps with React, Redux, and Webpack, which are all these projects. They're all based on that. So I already generated it. So I'm going to go to Universal first. And what Universal is single-page apps. Search engines have trouble indexing websites that are very JavaScript heavy and single-page. The markup, it's the search engines have trouble indexing it because when they're scanning the web for it, it doesn't actually render all the content. So you might have like a really nice application, and if you're depending on the search engine, a lot of them can't really index it well, and you'll have this all the metadata from your site won't actually be saved properly on the search engine. So I've created, they have this term called isomorphic or universal, which actually within this specific project, what I've done was sync the client and the server to be in sync, and to also share state and routing. So it's a really complex. It took me a really long time to figure out. But if I run it, and I can show you what I'm talking about. So this is Webpack. It bundles everything. Basically, what that means is it basically outputs one JavaScript file onto your index page, the main page. So it looks the same because I've made each template very similar to each other. So that's another nice thing, is that you have the same file structure between each template, whether that be regular, universal, or Electron. But if we look at view page source, this is all the CSS in my application. This wouldn't show up in production, but this is all my CSS in my application. So there's no flash on load. Everything loads immediately, which is another thing that's nice about universal isomorphic applications. And also, if you look down here, there's this window initial state. And what this does is, for those who are not familiar, Redux is basically a state control API, basically, where there's a single place where all your data is stored. And what this is doing is it's populating the index page with this data, so the server and the client can read it in sync with each other. And if you had, for example, if you had it like a GET request, and you're populating your website's populated by like an API, and you need this data, if you didn't have an isomorphic application, right now I haven't populated anything, it would look like this. This is just the markup that's already in my index page. But if you have a API, if you're using, like say you do a GET request, when you load up immediately, it's already pre-rendered, so it doesn't have to wait. It's immediately already there, and that's why this works better for SEO. So that is universal. And then if I go to Electron, this was interesting to get running also. It's, if anyone's, if for those who aren't familiar with Electron, Electron is an open source project from the people at GitHub, and things like Atom is built in it, and Slack. There's several other things that are built on Electron, but those are the ones that I guess most everyone at the Firehose project would be familiar with. So if I run this, Webpack bundles it, and then what will happen is it will launch this window, and it's really just a browser, but it's really not, it's not at the same time because you don't have all the same functionality. So if I type, this is linked to the Firehose project's website. If I click on that, it'll load, but if you look down here, it's not loading the jQuery. So it's not exactly a browser, but it has similar functionality to it. And another nice thing about this generated Electron template is it also has all the dev tools included already. So it's not going to find React, but if I go back and rerun it, so it has all these dev tools included. So here's the React dev tools. Let me make this bigger. React dev tools. So it shows you all your components and the state it's managing in its different components and all the params and props to each component. There's the Redux dev tools, which I said before was this thing's in the way. It manages all your, if I don't know, most maybe for those who are familiar, this is where your actions would go, and this also can keep track of your state, so all your data within your application. And then there's also, I haven't gone into this yet, but this is the dev tools for Electron, which I guess has a lot of native desktop-related OS hooks and stuff like that. So you can do, for example, like notifications up here. Yeah, that's Mikey.
Very cool stuff. And for everybody else, this is like really, really, really advanced stuff. And to the point where like some of this, like me and Michael were working together a little bit, and like I spent like dozens of hours trying to get some of the stuff working that he ended up getting working in like the universal and stuff like that. So this is like really crazy advanced stuff, but it's also really cool stuff. And if anybody, I think actually Nathan Elliott had a really good question about Axios.
Oh, okay.
He asked, do you have Axios already in it, or did you need to add it?
So yeah, I didn't clarify that. I'd eventually like to add it that when you're importing a dependency to a specific file, that it installs it if it's not installed. But currently, you have to have it for it to actually use it. It has to be installed already, but it'll still write that dependency to the file.
Cool, got it. What about, so Nick says, if you have never used a JS framework before, which is the easiest to start a small project? Ember, Angular, React, Meteor, etc. What do you think, Michael?
React is definitely the smallest. It's not necessarily a framework, but with all the NPM dependencies, it can be similar to a full-fledged framework. That's another thing with React, is that you don't get everything. It's a very small API, so there's a lot less to learn, but the concepts are very, very like complex, and there's a lot of things. If you get into Redux, there's a lot of functional programming related topics. There's you get into immutable data structures and stuff where it's a lot to get your head around, but those concepts I think will translate over if you've done React and you've done Redux, then something like Angular 2, which has similar concepts, and then the newer, Ember, I think it's Ember 2, they use components and they use state. And so I think right now, in terms of like scope, that React is probably the easiest to get into at first, because you're just writing, you're still just writing HTML technically. It's the same syntax, or close to it, and then you're just dealing with a few different methods, like on components there's like lifecycle methods. So when a component renders, before it renders you can tell it to do something. After it renders you can tell it to do something. And you can also, it's very modular, so if you don't want to just learn React and Redux and Node, you can add, actually I think someone's going to talk about it, you can just learn React on top of Rails, which is a whole nother thing, but it's much smaller and easier to get into.
Yeah, the one thing I might add on top of that is I feel like Ember 1 is really similar to Rails. So I think if you know Rails, you can probably pick up Ember like a lot quicker, as opposed to what Michael's talking about, these like complex computer science things that like you need to learn to actually fully understand React. Like once you understand them, it's kind of simple, but like understanding the hard stuff can be a little bit difficult too.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Yeah, think of it too as what's the available resource that's behind the technology as well. Ember is a fairly open source project where you don't have the backing, the financial backing of a company like Facebook. Same with Angular. Angular would be great, but they completely overhauled it. So anybody who's coming from Angular 1 or who learned Angular 1 is struggling with learning Angular 2. Versus if you just jumped into Angular 2, it would be a whole different story. But Angular 2 is so new and so fresh that the material out there isn't widely available. So it almost may not even be what's the easiest to learn, but what has the most resources and what's going to be there for the future. If everybody's going to this component-based JS framework, then why not stick with something that's going to be there for numerous years because you have a huge juggernaut backing it? So it's something to think about, but it's going to be like the same thing with any sort of framework. A battle between Bootstrap and Foundation, or whether to not do it or just write straight JavaScript versus using a framework, The
article that I linked in the chat window about Angular, Ember, and React has a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, Colin, covered in the article, including older versions versus newer versions, how many downloads there are, how many forks there are, the kind of support that each of the frameworks have, which ones are closer and further from Rails in their I guess, paradigm. It's a really good article, very helpful as far as trying to figure out which direction to go in.
Honestly, though, I mean, I actually might even recommend someone who's just trying to get into the JavaScript framework to get a sense of Node, because then you're getting into using like common JS, which is like that importing I was talking about before. And maybe even you can learn how to build a server in this API called Express, and build like a little tiny CRUD app in Node, and maybe get into that and get familiar with how the JS ecosystem works. Because if you build that, then you can add on something else on top of it, and you can keep extending it.
So is Mikey an open source project that's looking for contributors?
Yes. More than I would love someone to contribute to it because it's just been me this time, and some help from Ken.
There was one other guy that helped out. Didn't he do like one pull request?
Yeah, he. I was trying to figure out how to get the npm install. When it installs it, it runs all this crazy graphical loading, this loading bar, and I couldn't get it. And then he made a pull request, or he forked it, and then he said he was going to do it, and then I found it, and then he pull requested it. So that's basically the only contribution to the project.
It's super cool. I've used it quite a bit, and it's pretty awesome. So if you're if you're learning React, like, I think it might be. There's the Facebook one that they just sort of. Maybe that's a good question for you, Michael. What's your opinion about the Facebook, like Dan Abramov's CLI?
That's what I was going to ask too. Is this the same thing as that, just jacked up on steroids to make it more like Rails?
Yeah, his is kind of interesting. I don't know if I agree with the way they went about it, because their idea behind it is they're concealing a lot of like it's intimidating getting into like this React and JavaScript and Webpack, especially the bundler I was showing you, because there's a lot of configuration. They hide it from you, which is good and it's bad, because then you're not exposed to it, and then you really have I don't know. It's hard. It's like it can go both ways, but it doesn't have. You don't get like file generation. You don't have a lot of the tree structure, the way it's organized. Testing, all that stuff is built in. So, for example, Mikey, whereas that's just like you want to build something in 2 seconds. It's not as quick. So if you're learning, it might be better to start with it. But if you kind of have an idea of how Webpack works, and you want all that exposed to you so you can modify it, then something like Mikey would be a better choice.
Yeah, I think so too. Cool. Does anybody else have any other questions for Michael?